Chapter 37. The Radio. Detective Ray Na Tu. Cole arrived the next morning in a state car with mud already dried on the wheel wells, and she was, Nancy thought within the first 30 seconds of meeting her, exactly the kind of investigator Nancy would have wanted on the other end of one of her own calls. Unhurried, precise, unwilling to be impressed by anything until it had earned it. She had the look of a woman who'd driven a very long way on very little sleep and considered neither fact worth mentioning, a thermos in one hand and a case file already tucked under her arm before she'd finished closing the car door. She heard the whole account again in Pratt's office, the wharf visit, the buoy paint, the count of 63 faded pots riding empty over Dickie's own gear, and took notes in a small, cramped hand, and asked exactly 4 questions, each one sharper than the last, and at the end of it said only, "That's good work. Amateur work, but good. I'd like to see the boat myself before I decide what it means." "It's still tied up at his float," Pratt said. "Nobody's moved her. Didn't seem right to, before now." "Then let's go look at her properly," Cole said, and stood, and that was, as far as Nancy could tell, the whole of her decision-making process. No ceremony, no drama, just the next necessary thing. Owen brought them out again in his brother-in-law's skiff. Cole, in the bow with a flashlight and a pair of nitrile gloves she produced from her coat pocket like a woman who kept them the way other people kept spare change, and Lil Miss Lois rode at her mooring exactly as Nancy remembered her. Weathered, patient, her name repainted more than once in a careful hand. Cole went over the boat inch by inch, unhurried, saying little, and it was Owen, crouched at the stern working a coil of old line aside, who found it. "Detective?" Something in his voice made all of them go still. "There's something wedged down here." It had lodged in the narrow gap between the transom and the fish box, tucked down out of easy sight, caught by its own strap on a cleat. A pair of orange ear defenders, the kind with the little AM/FM radio built into the band, the plastic cracked clean across one cup, the dial frozen at a single point on the numbers. Cole crouched over it a long moment without touching it, then drew it out with 2 gloved fingers, careful as a woman lifting something that might still be alive. "If a man goes overboard wearing these," she said slowly, half to herself, half to Pratt, "they come off. Water does that, strap slips, buoyancy does the rest, and they either float free or they sink separate from the body. They don't end up wedged down in the scuppers under a fish box." She turned it over once in her hand. This didn't go in the water at all. This came off him on the boat, before he ever left it. Nobody spoke. Nancy was looking at the cracked cup, the frozen dial, and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the wind off the water. Because she knew that static, she realized. She knew the exact particular hiss of a signal caught between 2 stations. She had heard it in a dream 2 nights running, and she had no way on earth to explain to Detective Ray Na Tu Cole how she knew it. So she said nothing at all, and let the knowing sit in her like a stone. Her hands had gone cold in a way the October air alone didn't account for, and she pressed them flat against her own knees to keep anyone from noticing the small, involuntary tremor that had started somewhere in her chest and worked its way outward. She had spent 30 years trusting only what she could verify. She had nothing to verify this with, nothing but a dream and a dead man's voice, and the plastic and wire sitting in Cole's gloved hand agreed with her anyway, in a language a detective could actually use. "Bag it," Cole said to Pratt, "and get me whoever it was called this in as an accidental drowning. I want to know exactly what they did and didn't look at down here." Dana Greenleaf came to Cindy's shop 2 days later, while the gals were turning over a box of estate sale postcards, and stood in the doorway a moment before she came in, the hesitation of a woman deciding whether a thing was hers to say. She was younger than Nancy had pictured Junior's wife. Sturdy, weathered around the eyes the way everyone on that coast seemed weathered. A woman who looked like she'd spent 30 years standing next to a man the village had decided wrongly to distrust. Her hands, when she finally sat, would not stay still, moving from her lap to the strap of her purse to the edge of the table and back again. The restless motion of someone who had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times on the drive over, and still hadn't found the version of it that felt safe to say out loud. "Cindy said you were the ones asking questions," Dana said. "The right kind of questions, for once, instead of the kind that already know the answer they want." She twisted her hands together once and stopped herself. "I don't know if this means anything. I've gone back and forth on whether to say it. But Junior's sitting in a cell in Ellsworth over buoys that weren't even his, and I'd rather say a foolish thing than sit quiet and watch that keep happening." "Sit down," Mary said and pulled a chair over, and Carol's hand found the back of it without being asked, steadying it. "Mike Viarney borrowed gear out of our shed back in the spring," Dana said. "Garrett's nephew. Junior's never trusted that boy as far as he could throw him, but the shed's not locked. Half the gear in this village passes hand to hand, and Mike had some story about his own radio being busted and needing to borrow a set for a haul." She twisted her hands again. "He never brought it back. I didn't think much of it. Half of what leaves that shed doesn't come back. That's just how it goes around here. But it was a set just like that one." She nodded toward the evidence bag Pratt had left with Cindy the day before, sealed and labeled, sitting on the counter awaiting pickup. "Orange band. Cracked cup. Even then, I remember because I told him he ought to just buy a new set instead of nursing that one along, and he laughed and said it still worked fine, station and all." "What station?" Nancy asked, very quietly. "That's the part I keep turning over," Dana said. "It's an old-timers station. Fishing forecast, tide tables, that kind of thing out of Machias. Nobody Mike's age listens to it. His own truck radio's always got something with a beat to it, loud enough you can hear it 2 docks over. But that little set he borrowed was already tuned to the forecast station when he took it. Dickey Station. I remember because I thought it was strange. A young man borrowing an old man's gear and never once thinking to retune it to something he'd actually want to hear." Nancy sat very still and did not say the thing that wanted saying, which was, "He never retuned it because it wasn't the one he borrowed. It's the one he took off a dead man's head and put back wrong, and never noticed it wedged itself somewhere he didn't check before he pushed the rest of the story into the water." "You should tell Detective Cole exactly what you told us," Mary said instead gently. "All of it. Every detail, even the ones that seem small." "I'm scared to," Dana admitted. "Scared of what it means if I'm right, and scared of what it means for Junior if I'm wrong, and I've just handed them a coincidence dressed up as evidence." "Tell the truth as plainly as you know it," Nancy said, and heard her own dispatcher's voice come up under the words, steady, the voice she'd used on 1,000 callers who needed to be talked down from the edge of their own fear into the plain facts of what had actually happened. "That's all any of us can do. Let the people whose job it is to weigh it, weigh it." Dana looked at her a long moment, and something in her face eased, the relief of a person handed permission to stop carrying a thing alone. "All right," she said. "All right. I'll go this afternoon." Cole called Pratt's office 2 days after that, and Pratt, to his credit, drove straight to the inn himself instead of telephoning, and found the 3 of them on the porch with their coffee going cold in the October air. "Broadcast log confirms it," he said without preamble, the manner of a man who'd decided plain speaking was owed to people who'd earned it. Machias Station keeps an automated log of everything that goes out, going back months, in case of FCC complaints. Small Craft Advisory ran that afternoon the exact window Doc Halliday puts as time of death based on what we know now. And Mike Viarney's own phone puts him within a half-mile of Dickey's Wharf that same window. Cell tower records, not something he can talk his way around. Pratt shook his head slowly, looking out at the water like it had personally disappointed him. He told Cole flat out he was never near the man's property that whole week. Swore to it twice. Man doesn't swear to a lie twice over a coincidence. What happens now? Mary asked. Now Cole brings him in properly, and Garrett Pelletier finds out real quick just how much a nephew is worth to him when the nephew stops being useful and starts being a liability, Pratt said. And something hard came into his voice that hadn't been there before. In my experience, ladies, that's usually when the real trouble starts. A man who'll frame his neighbor to protect his business isn't the kind who goes down quiet when it's his own family on the line instead. He looked at each of them in turn, the weight of the warning settling into the space between them. I'd ask you to be careful the next few days. More careful than you've already been, which I know isn't saying much, given the broken glass and the note under your wiper. Man backed into a corner doesn't always think clearly about who else is standing near the walls. Out over the water, a bell buoy rang once, faint and far off, and did not ring again. Chapter 38. What Family Was Worth. They brought Mike Viarney in on a Thursday, and by Thursday afternoon, the whole village knew it, the way a small place always knows things, before any official word had gone out at all. A truck seen at the sheriff's building that shouldn't have been there, a name passed along a checkout line, a silence in the diner that meant something specific instead of nothing at all. Pratt asked the gals to come by that evening, not as witnesses exactly. Cole was careful about that distinction, careful in a way that told Nancy she'd done this dance with well-meaning civilians before. But to formally close the loop on the buoy count and the wharf visit, tie off the details only they could confirm. They were in the small waiting room outside Pratt's office, Carol's cane resting against her knee, when the outer door opened and Garrett Pelletier walked in with a lawyer half a step behind him, and the temperature of the room changed the way weather changes before you feel the first drop of rain. He was smaller than Nancy had pictured him somehow for a man who'd loomed so large in every account of him. Trim, silver-templed, dressed for a boardroom rather than a coastal village, a man who'd clearly decided a long time ago that looking prosperous was its own kind of armor. He didn't look at the gals at all, at first. He looked at the door to Pratt's office like a man sizing up a door he intended to walk straight through. "I want to see my nephew," he said to the desk officer. Not loud, just certain, the certainty of a man unused to being told no. "He's being processed," the officer said. "You can wait." "I don't wait," Garrett said, and something in his voice made Carol's hand tighten, very slightly, on the head of her cane. Cole came out of the inner office before it could go further, unhurried as ever, and looked at Garrett with an expression that gave away nothing at all. "Mr. Pelletier, I understand you're the boy's uncle." "I'm his employer," Garrett said, "and I'll be candid with you, detective, since candor seems to be the fashion around here today. I have no idea what Mike's gotten himself mixed up in, but I run a legitimate business, and whatever trouble he's found for himself, he's found alone. Family is family. Business is business. I'd be a fool to let one drag down the other." He said it smoothly, the words already worn into a groove, a sentence that had clearly been rehearsed on the drive over. If there's some misunderstanding about buoys or paint or whatever this is, I'll cooperate fully. But I want it on the record now, before this goes any further, that I had no knowledge of and no involvement in anything my nephew may or may not have done. It was, Nancy thought, watching him say it, one of the coldest things she had ever heard a man say about a member of his own family, delivered in a tone better suited to declining a business proposal. "Noted," Cole said, entirely unmoved. "You understand we'll want to verify that independently. Phone records, financial records. The paint used on those buoys at Mr. Greenleaf's dock is a specific commercial marine formula, Detective, and it turns out there are only 2 suppliers on this whole stretch of coast who carry it in that shade of red. One of them is a hardware store in Bar Harbor with a register tape going back 4 years. The other is your own pound supply shed." Something moved behind Garrett's eyes, there and gone so fast that if Nancy hadn't been watching for exactly that kind of thing, 30 years of listening to voices for the half-second where the story didn't hold, she might have missed it entirely. "That paint is common enough," Garrett said, still smooth, but the groove had a catch in it now. "I'd have to check my own inventory records to say who had access to it and when." "We'll be asking to see those records," Cole said. "Today, if it's convenient. This week, if it isn't." The lawyer, who had said nothing at all until this moment, put a hand lightly on Garrett's arm, the universal gesture of counsel suggesting a client had said enough for one afternoon, and Garrett's jaw worked once, and he let himself be steered a half-step back. But his eyes found the gal's then, for the first time, sweeping across the 3 of them with the flat, assessing look of a man recalculating a business problem. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped, pitched just for them, just under what the desk officer or Cole could easily overhear. "I understand you 3 are the ones who've been so industrious," he said, "asking questions all up and down this coast. I hope you've enjoyed your visit to Maine." A pause, mild as weather. "It's a beautiful state, full of accidents. Lobstermen drown, hikers fall, tourists get turned around on unfamiliar roads at night. Terrible, how often it happens, and how little anyone can ever really explain why." The room had gone very quiet. Carol's hand was flat and still on the head of her cane now, no longer gripping, and Nancy understood the way she understood things about people who thought they were being subtle, that Carol had gone still the way a person goes still when they've decided a thing is not worth flinching at. Nancy ran the old assessment without meaning to. The one 30 years had carved so deep into her, it no longer felt like a choice. Exits, distance, whether the threat in the room was the kind that used its hands or only its money. Garrett Pelletier was, she decided, watching his carefully composed face, entirely the second kind, and somehow that made the mildness of his voice worse rather than better, because a man who threatened you with his hands was afraid of something, and a man who threatened you this smoothly, in a sheriff's waiting room with a detective standing 10 feet away, was not afraid of anything at all. "That's an interesting thing to say to 3 women sitting in a sheriff's office," Nancy said, and her own voice came out steady, flat, the exact voice she'd used on 100 callers who'd wanted her to be afraid because they were, with a detective and a desk officer both standing close enough to hear every word of it. Something flickered across Garrett's face. Not quite surprise, but close to it. The affront of a man unused to having his own tactics named back at him in front of witnesses. "I only meant to say," Garrett said, recovering smooth again, "that Maine can be an unpredictable place for people who don't know it well." "We're getting to know it quite well, actually," Mary said pleasantly, and there was nothing pleasant at all in the way she said it. The lawyer's hand tightened on Garrett's arm, more firmly this time, and this time Garrett let himself be moved, out through the door and into the last of the daylight, and the door swung shut behind him on its own weight with a small definitive click. Cole watched it close, unreadable as ever, and then looked at the 3 of them with something that might, in a woman less careful with her face, have been the beginning of respect. "For the record," she said, That was not a subtle man just now. No, Nancy agreed, he wasn't. We'll be looking hard at those inventory records, Cole said, and at every call between his phone and his nephew's going back 6 months. Man like that doesn't get his hands dirty himself, generally. He finds someone who will, and points them, and stands well back. She glanced toward the inner office where the low murmur of a very different conversation, Mike's, presumably, and whatever he was in the process of confessing or refusing to confess, carried faintly through the wall. Sounds like the boy in there is starting to understand that standing well back doesn't leave a lot of room for two men. It was Pratt, an hour later, walking them out to the truck in the blue dark of early evening, who told them the rest of it. Not because he was supposed to, Nancy understood, but because he was the kind of sheriff who thought people who'd helped crack a case open deserved to know how it closed. He's talking, Pratt said. Mike. Once Cole laid the phone records out in front of him, his location that afternoon, the borrowed radio, his own uncle's texts telling him to handle the Herrick problem, whatever it takes, the boy folded up pretty fast. Says he never meant to kill him. Says Dickie never even turned around. Never knew he was there, and Mike lost his temper over being ignored and shoved him before he'd even thought about it. And by the time he understood what he'd done, it was already done. Pratt shook his head slowly. Says his uncle's the one who told him how to stage it after. Told him exactly where to leave the body. How long before somebody'd think to look. Told him which boys to lift and repaint, and when, and where to leave them so it'd point at Junior instead of him. And Garrett? Mary asked. Denying every word of the direction, of course, same as he told you in there, but handle the Herrick problem. Whatever it takes is sitting right there in black and white on that boy's phone, sent from his uncle's number, 4 days before Dickie died. Pratt's mouth was a hard line. A jury's going to have to decide what a man meant by a text like that. But I'll tell you what I think he meant by it, and I think most folks around here who've watched that man buy up half this coast, one desperate boat owner at a time, are going to think the same. He opened the truck door for Carol, waited while she found her seat by Feel. Conspiracy, evidence tampering, accessory after. District attorney's already talking charges, and I don't imagine all that money of his is going to make those particular words go away, whatever else it buys him. And Junior? Nancy asked. For the first time since she'd met him, Pratt smiled. A real one. Tired, but real. Released this afternoon. Dana's got him home already. Probably sitting at his own kitchen table right now eating a meal that isn't jail food and not quite believing yet that he's allowed to. He looked out at the darkening water, the lights of the village starting to come up one by one along the shore. Man spent 2 weeks in a cell for a crime built entirely out of buoys he never touched. I don't imagine he's going to forget the taste of that, whatever happens to Garrett Pelletier from here. No, Mary agreed quietly. I don't imagine he will. They drove back to the inn in a silence that wasn't heavy so much as full, the fullness of a thing finally set down after being carried a long way. And Nancy, watching the dark water slide by the window, thought of Dickie on the deck of his own boat, hands full of wire, never once turning around, and found that for the first time since the cellar hole, she wasn't afraid of what the next dream might show her. She thought instead that it might finally be a kind one. Chapter 39. What the Table Held. Dana called the inn the next morning, her voice thick with a happiness that hadn't quite steadied itself yet, and asked, in a rush that ran several sentences together before she caught her breath, whether the gals would come by the house that evening. Junior wants to thank you properly, she said, and I want to feed somebody who isn't just the two of us staring at each other like we can't believe it, because we've been doing that since yesterday and I think we need witnesses before we drive each other crazy with it. The Greenleaf house sat back from the shore road behind a stand of birches gone fully gold, a modest salt box with smoke curling from the chimney, and every window lit against the early dark. And when Dana opened the door, the smell that came out to meet them, chowder, fresh bread, something with cinnamon underneath it, was so purely, defiantly domestic that Nancy felt something in her chest ease before she'd even crossed the threshold. Dana met them at the door before they'd even finished climbing the porch steps, apron dusted with flour, her whole face lit with a happiness so unguarded it made Nancy's own throat tighten unexpectedly. "Come in. Come in. Don't mind the mess. I've been cooking since noon and I haven't stopped moving long enough to look at what state the kitchen's in." She ushered them through with both hands, the smell of the kitchen rolling out ahead of her into the cold evening air, thick and warm and entirely unlike anything they'd smelled since Longstaff's. Junior himself looked thinner than Nancy remembered from the wharf, and older, 2 weeks of jail having worn something out of him that hadn't fully come back yet. But he crossed the kitchen the moment he saw them with his hand already extended, and when he took Nancy's in both of his grip was steady. There was a real grayness to his face that Nancy recognized from 30 years of meeting people on the worst day of their lives, and then sometimes on the day just after. The specific exhaustion of a body that had spent 2 weeks bracing for a blow that never stopped landing. His eyes, though, when they found each of theirs in turn, were entirely clear, and something in the directness of his attention told her the 2 weeks had cost him plenty but hadn't managed to take that. "I don't rightly know how to thank 3 strangers for pulling me out of a hole I didn't dig," he said, and his voice caught on the last word, and he didn't try to hide it. "Dana tells me it was buoy paint of all the fool things. My whole life might have turned on a smear of paint on a blind woman's cane, and I want you to know I understand exactly how much luck was mixed up in that, and how little I did to deserve it." "You didn't need luck," Carol said, finding his hand and holding it a moment in both of hers, the way she held things that mattered. "You needed somebody paying attention. That's not the same as luck. That's just somebody finally doing the noticing you'd already earned." Junior's throat worked, and he nodded, and didn't trust himself to answer that right away. Nancy watched him gather himself and thought, not for the first time since they'd landed in this cove, how strange it was that the ending she'd once have called success, the case solved, the right man cleared, the wrong one exposed, had turned out to feel less like triumph and more like this, sitting at a stranger's kitchen table, watching a grieving man rebuild his own dignity, one careful sentence at a time. 30 years of closing calls had taught her that the moment the crisis ended was rarely the moment that mattered most. This was. Watching somebody remember how to be believed. They ate at the kitchen table, crowded and warm, Dana filling bowls before anyone had quite finished the last one, and the conversation moved the way conversation does after a long fear finally breaks, circling the hard thing without landing on it directly, finding its way instead through small, ordinary questions. How the lobster rolls back home compared, whether Florida ever really cooled down, what Carol missed most about seeing when she let herself think about it, which she answered honestly and without self-pity, the whole table quieter and more attentive for it. Carol answered that last question slowly, turning her spoon once in her chowder before she spoke. "I miss color sometimes," she said. "Not faces, not really. I've made my peace with faces. But color, I remember red. I remember it was warm somehow, even just to look at before I lost the looking." She smiled, unhurried. "I get by well enough on the rest of it. Hands tell you nearly everything a face would, if you're patient. But I'll admit I still miss red." Dana refilled coffee cups that didn't need refilling and hovered near Junior's chair in a way that wasn't quite fussing, more like a woman reassuring herself, every few minutes, that he was actually there to hover near. At one point, she rested her hand flat on his shoulder for no particular reason at all, just passing behind his chair, and he reached up without looking and covered it with his own for a moment before letting her go on to the stove. And Nancy watched the whole small wordless exchange and thought it said more about the two of them than either of them had managed to say out loud all evening. It was over pie, Dana's own crust, flaky enough that Carol declared it worth the trip to Maine on its own merits. That Junior finally said the thing he'd clearly been working up to all evening. 40 years I fished alongside Dickie Herrick, he said, turning his fork slowly, not eating. 40 years of hollering at each other on the wharf loud enough the whole cove could hear it, and not one soul in this village ever understood that was just how the two of us loved each other, because neither one of us had the first idea how to say it plain. He looked up and his eyes were wet, and he didn't apologize for it. I keep thinking about how he died not knowing I'd have walked through fire for him. I keep thinking somebody killed him, thinking the two of us hated each other bad enough that framing me would hold. And the worst part is, for about 2 weeks, half this village believed it too. And I don't know how you come back from knowing that's how thin the story of a friendship looks from the outside. A small, unsteady laugh worked its way out of him, gone almost as soon as it arrived. Man couldn't drive past a neighbor loading a truck without pulling over to help, whether they wanted the help or not. Half his own gear was scattered across 3 towns at any given time, left behind wherever somebody needed an extra pair of hands that week. Al down at the Lobster Pound still had Dickie's spare vest sitting in his truck bed the whole month before he died, from when Dickie helped him haul lumber for a new smoker. I doubt Al's even noticed it's still there. Nancy went very still over her own plate, some old, careful part of her filing the detail away without yet knowing why it mattered, only that it did. He knew, Mary said quietly, with the certainty of a woman who had spent 2 weeks reconstructing exactly this. Cindy told us about the funeral, about you carrying Lois. A man doesn't ask somebody he merely tolerates to carry his wife to her grave. Whatever the village believed, for 2 weeks, Dickie himself knew precisely what you were to him, right up until the end. Junior set down his fork, and for a moment nobody said anything at all, the kitchen full of wood smoke and cinnamon, and the particular quiet of grief finally being allowed to sit at the table instead of hiding from it. I'm going to take his boat out once everything's settled, Junior said eventually. Lil miss Lois. Somebody's got to haul what's left of his gear, and I'd rather it be done by a hand that knew him than by strangers from the county. And I've been thinking, there's a dog that needs somewhere permanent to be once all this legal business is finished, and it seems to me a Newfoundland ought to have a say in who takes him in. I mean to ask him. He's already got somewhere, Carol said gently. Cindy's had him since the week Dickie died. I don't believe that dog intends to leave her now, and I don't believe Cindy intends to let him. Junior nodded slowly, something loosening further in his weathered face. Good, he said. That's good. He picked well then, without anybody asking his opinion at all. A small, real smile, the first Nancy had seen from him all evening. I'll send Lobster over for him anyway. Man doesn't have to live under your roof for you to look after him. He'd like that, Carol said. I have it on good authority he's already partial to being spoiled. They stayed until the fire burned low and Dana's coffee had gone around twice, and when they finally rose to leave, Junior walked them all the way to the car, standing in his own dooryard in the cold, with his arms wrapped against it, watching them go the way a man watches something he has newly learned not to take for granted. Come back sometime, he called as Nancy started the engine. Not because of any of this. Just to eat pie and not be investigating anything. We'd like that, Mary called back, and meant it, and the porch light stayed on behind them the whole way down the dark road, small and steady and entirely unwilling to go out before they were safely gone. Chapter 40. What the Cove Decided. The co-op called its second meeting of the month on a Thursday evening, and this one filled the fire hall past standing room, folding chairs borrowed from the church basement lined clear back to the doors, children underfoot, a table along one wall sagging under the weight of casseroles and pies that nobody had been asked to bring and everybody had brought anyway. Different room than last time, Carol observed, her hand finding Nancy's arm as they came through the door, the noise and warmth of it washing over her like weather. I can hear it in the air. Last time this room was holding its breath. Tonight it's not. She wasn't wrong. The charged quiet of the emergency meeting 3 weeks back had given way to something looser, louder, the specific clatter of a room that had already survived the worst of what it feared and was only now getting around to being properly relieved about it. Dell took the card table at the front this time, and nobody seemed surprised by it. The harbor master and 2 other longtime co-op officers arranged behind him like a council that had reformed itself without any formal announcement of when or how. "We've got business," Dell said, once the room had settled. "And I'll keep it plain, because plain's served this cove better than fancy lately." He looked out over the crowded folding chairs. "First order. The co-op's voting tonight to formally protect Dickie Herrick's moorings and gear. Permanent, same as we do for any member's family in his situation, until such time as somebody in his line wants to fish them or the estate settles otherwise. That means nobody touches his pots without Junior's say-so. Nobody so much as looks sideways at his mooring space, and any buyer coming through this co-op answers to the whole membership if they try otherwise." A hand went up near the front, one of the younger fishermen. "Second." "All in favor," Dell said, and the room answered with a raised hand unanimity that didn't leave room for counting. A wave of hands going up all at once the way a tide comes in, all together, not needing to be told twice. "Second order of business," Dell went on, and something in his weathered face eased for the first time all evening. "We've had a copy made of the old landing agreement Cindy dug out of that box, the one from 47, and every signature on it's been traced to a family still fishing this cove or close enough kin to it. Lawyer in Ellsworth says it'll likely hold up, unrecorded or not, given how long it's been honored without anybody ever formally challenging it. Which means, going forward, no man in this room has to wonder whether he's got a right to land his own catch on his own shore. That right's been ours the whole time. We just forgot we had the paper to prove it." The room broke into something between applause and relieved laughter, and Nancy, standing near the back with Mary and Carol, felt something in her own chest loosen that she hadn't quite realized she'd been holding since the moment Mary first unfolded that yellowed page in Cindy's back room. Near the front, the woman who'd confessed at the last meeting to selling her own licenses to Garrett made her way over to where Junior stood and said something too quiet for Nancy to catch, and Junior's face did something complicated, surprise giving way to something gentler, before he nodded and reached out to shake her offered hand. It wasn't a large gesture. Nobody made a speech about it. But Nancy watched 3 other people find their way to him in the minutes that followed, each with some small word of their own, an apology, or the closest thing this village knew how to offer instead of one, and understood that this, too, was a kind of vote, the kind that never made it onto anyone's official record. Junior stood near the front, Dana's hand tight in his, and when Dell called his name a moment later, the whole room turned toward him with the close attention reserved for a man who had been wrongly doubted and was, in this one room at least, being publicly undoubted in return. "Junior's agreed to take on Dickie's gear himself," Dell said. "Haul what's left, keep the pots working the way Dickie would have wanted them worked, and the co-ops agreed, unanimous, that any income off Dickie's traditional grounds goes toward a scholarship in his name First, for any young person in this cove who wants to go into marine biology, conservation, that line of work. Seemed fitting. Man spent 60 years teaching anybody who'd stand still long enough how this water actually works. No reason that should stop just because he's not here to keep teaching it himself. Junior's throat worked, and he didn't try to hide it. And when he finally spoke, his voice came out rougher than Nancy had heard it even at his own kitchen table. "I'll do right by it," he said simply, and that seemed to be enough for the room because nobody asked him to say more. Bowie, who had been lying with his great head on his paws near Cindy's feet through the whole proceeding, chose that exact moment to sit up and let out one low, decisive bark, and the whole hall dissolved into laughter, the relief of grief finally finding a place to set itself down that wasn't purely sorrow. "He agrees," Cindy said, scratching behind the dog's ears, "and he'd know if anybody would." Afterward, the folding chairs got pushed back against the walls and somebody produced a radio. And what had been a business meeting became, without anyone quite deciding it should, something closer to a wake that had waited politely for the paperwork to finish before allowing itself to become a celebration instead. Mary found herself dancing with Dell's wife's cousin, a barrel-chested man with surprisingly light feet. Carol held court near the pie table, describing the whole layout of the room to anyone who asked, and several who didn't, entirely in her element. And Nancy stood for a while near the door, watching the whole warm chaos of it, and thought that this, more than the arrest or the confession or any of the evidence they'd painstakingly assembled, felt like the actual ending of the thing they'd come to Maine and accidentally finished. "You look like a woman deciding something," Mary said, appearing at her elbow, slightly breathless from dancing. "I'm deciding I like this place a great deal more than I expected to, 3 weeks ago." "That's not a decision," Mary said. "That's just true. You've liked it since the Moosehead." "I liked the Moosehead ironically." "There's no such thing as liking a taxidermy moose in a Christmas sweater ironically," Mary said. "You're implicated the second you laugh at it. I've got the receipt to prove it." Nancy, despite herself, laughed, and let the sound of the room carry her the rest of the way into the evening. Chapter 41. Where the Tide Takes Him. She dreamed of him one more time their last night at the inn, and it was nothing at all like the others. There was no cellar hole, no wharf, no radio losing its signal and finding it again. There was only the burying ground in the low gold light of very early morning, the dew still on the grass, and Lois Herrick's stone with its 3 small stones beside it and its careful lettering. She made everything better, and Dickie standing before it. Not lost this time, not frightened, not reaching for a piece he couldn't find. He was simply standing, waiting, the way he'd once waited on the tide. The grass here was wet with dew in a way that felt, even in the dream, entirely real against her ankles, and the maples along the wall had gone the deep, quiet red of very early light, before the sun had fully decided what color the day was going to be. Somewhere behind her, a bird she couldn't name was singing the same 4 notes over and over, patient, unhurried, as though it had all the time in the world to get them exactly right. She saw Lois before he did, or thought she did, a shape at the tree line, unhurried, unmistakable even at that distance the way you know your own kitchen in the dark, and Dickie turned as she came, and his whole face changed. Not the lost look, not the frightened one, but something Nancy hadn't seen on him at all until that moment, something so plain and so complete that she felt it in her own chest like a held breath finally let go. "There you are," Lois said exactly the way he'd told her she would. "Here I am," Dickie agreed, and his voice had none of the thin, radiostatic strangeness it had carried through every other dream. It was just a voice. A man's voice, saying an ordinary thing to his wife after being away too long. Lois laughed. Nancy heard it, clear and real, an old woman's laugh with no weight of grief in it at all, and held her hand out to her husband. He took it. His hand did not pass through hers. It closed around it, sure and solid. The whole hand of a man who'd spent 60 years hauling wire and mending gear and had, in that single, ordinary gesture, finally stopped losing his grip on things. "I couldn't find the boat," Dickie said, but he said it the way you'd mention a small worry now safely behind you. "I kept trying to get down to her, and there was a piece missing, and I couldn't take hold of it." "I know," Lois said. "You don't need the boat anymore. You're not going back out." "No," Dickie agreed and looked down at their joined hands as if, testing, one last time, that they'd stay that way. They did. "No, I suppose I'm not." "And Bowie?" Nancy heard herself ask, because someone had to, because the dog's ears working the harbor water were the last thing she'd carry out of this whole strange business, and she needed to know before the dream let her go. Something eased in Dickie's face at the name, a warmth entirely without worry in it. "He's exactly where he ought to be," he said. "That antiques woman. Cindy. Good hands, that one. I watched her a while before I let myself stop watching. She'll spoil him rotten, and he'll let her, and that's precisely the arrangement a dog like that deserves after everything." He said it the way you'd close a ledger, satisfied, a debt settled. "I don't need to fret over him anymore. That's a fine thing, not needing to fret over the ones you love. I'd forgotten how fine until just now." He looked past Lois's shoulder then, straight at Nancy, the way the dead had always looked at her in these dreams, not through her, not around her, but directly, as if the dream had built a door just her size and he was choosing deliberately to speak through it one last time. "Thank you," he said, "for coming back when I asked you to, for not letting them believe the easy story." His hand tightened, once, around his wife's. "A man ought to be allowed to be remembered rightly. You gave me that." "I didn't do it alone," Nancy said, and even in the dream her voice caught. "No," Dickie agreed with the ghost of his old dry humor. "Nobody worth remembering ever does." He turned then, unhurried, his hand still folded around his wife's, and the two of them started off together across the grass toward the tree line and the pale gold light beyond it. And Dickie went without looking back, not because he'd forgotten anyone, Nancy understood, but because he was, at last, exactly where he needed to be, and a man didn't need to look back at a door he was finally, fully walking through. The dream didn't thin and fray the way the others had. It simply ended the way a good evening ends, gently, at the natural place, with nothing left unsaid. Nancy woke to full daylight, Mary already up and moving quietly around the room, and lay still a moment letting the last of it settle over her like warmth instead of cold. Her chest didn't have the tight-held quality it usually had after one of these, the careful bracing of a woman waiting to find out what the dream had cost her. This one had simply given something back, and she lay there a moment longer than she needed to, reluctant to let even the last edges of it go. "Good one?" Mary asked, catching her face. "The best one," Nancy said, and found she meant it entirely. She lay there a while longer, listening to Mary move around the room, the small, ordinary sounds of a suitcase being organized, a zipper, a drawer, and thought that she had spent this whole strange trip learning to trust things she couldn't verify. A dream, a hunch, the sure certainty that had settled into her chest the moment she'd first heard the word drowned and known, without knowing how, that the word was wrong. She didn't think that instinct would leave her, going home. She wasn't sure anymore that she wanted it to. Chapter 42. The Departure's Curb. Owen drove them to the airport himself, 2 hours each way for the privilege, though nobody had asked him to and he hadn't offered it as anything but obvious. The morning had come up cold and very clear, the kind of light that made every color on the drive look slightly more true than it had any right to. The last of the maples still holding their red, the spruce gone nearly black against a sky-scrubbed pale blue, frost silvering the grass in the low fields they passed. Nobody talked much on the drive. It didn't feel like a silence that needed filling. He carried Carol's bag without being asked and set it down exactly where she reached for it, which Nancy had noticed he always did, the small, precise courtesy of a man who paid closer attention than he let on. Mary went ahead through the doors to check them in, and Carol, with the tact of a woman who had decided a departure needed 2 fewer witnesses than it currently had, went with her, leaving Nancy and Owen standing together at the curb in the thin morning light. "So," Owen said. "So," Nancy agreed. "You never did tell me what all that was really about," he said. "The pots, the buoys, whatever it was that had you 3 out on my brother-in-law's skiff counting lobster gear like it was going to save somebody's life." "It did save somebody's life," Nancy said, "just not in the way you're picturing." She considered him a moment, the steady patience of him, the way he'd waited 2 weeks without pushing, the way he'd asked exactly once and then let it be. "I'll tell you the whole thing sometime, all of it. It's a strange story and part of it you're not going to believe, and I'd rather tell it to you somewhere we can sit down properly than shout the short version over a departures curb." "Is that an invitation to a longer conversation?" Owen said, "or a very polite way of telling me you're never coming back to Maine?" "It's an invitation," Nancy said, and was a little surprised by how easily it came out, how little it cost her to say it plainly. "I don't do subtle well. Never have. Ask anyone who's called 911 and gotten me on the line." Something in his face eased, the ease of a man who'd been more uncertain than he'd let show. "I don't mind plain," he said. "Plain's easier to trust." He reached into his jacket and came out with a folded scrap of paper already written, which told her he'd prepared it before he ever left his own house that morning. And the thought of that, a ranger who cataloged moose habitat and read tide charts for a living, sitting at his own kitchen table getting his handwriting steady before he'd know for certain there'd be a reason to hand it over, undid something in her more thoroughly than anything he might have said. "My number," he said, "in case plain includes phone calls?" "Plain includes phone calls," Nancy said, and took it and folded it once more before she put it away, the careful way you handle a thing you intend to keep. Mary's voice carried faintly from the doors. "Nancy, they're calling us," and Owen glanced that way and then back at her, unhurried even now, a man who'd apparently decided that a few extra seconds on a departures curb weren't going to cost either of them anything real. "Go on," he said, "before your friend comes back out here and starts reading me like she reads everything else." "She already has," Nancy said. "She read you the second we met you on that trail. She just hasn't said what conclusion she came to." "Probably wise of her," Owen said, and there was real warmth under it. Not performance. The same warmth she'd noticed the very first afternoon. "I'll look forward to finding out eventually." He was quiet a moment, looking out at the parking structure rather than at her, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone a little rougher around the edges. "For what it's worth, I wasn't planning on any of this. I want you to know that. I came out here 14 years ago because the woods were quiet and nobody in them asked much of me, and I built a whole life around not being asked. You've been asking without ever once meaning to, since the day you tripped over Lady Slipper Orchid, and I find I don't mind it nearly as much as I expected to." "I have that effect on people," Nancy said. "Ask my old supervisor. 30 years of asking questions nobody wanted to answer. I imagine you were very good at it." I imagine I was better at listening than asking, Nancy said. Most people don't need the question. They just need somebody patient enough to wait out the answer. I'll keep that in mind, Owen said. Next time, I owe you patience. She kissed his cheek, quick and unplanned, and felt him go still with surprise for half a second before he recovered, and then she was walking backward toward the doors, watching him watch her go. And the last thing she saw before Mary pulled her through into the terminal's bright fluorescent hum was Owen Woods standing at the curb with his hands in his jacket pockets, not waving, just watching, the stillness of a man who intended to be there again the next time she came back. And something in the set of his shoulders told her, plain as any radio forecast, that he already believed there would be a next time. Chapter 43. Your Table Was Waiting. The Green Marlin smelled the way it always smelled on a Friday evening, hot butter and lime and the brine of the raw bar, the ceiling fans turning their same lazy circles, the neon marlin out front just beginning to flicker to life against the dusk. And Mary stood in the doorway a moment before going in, letting it settle over her the way you let warm water settle over cold hands. "You're blocking the door," Carol said from just behind her, cane tapping once against the frame in gentle reproach. "I'm having a moment." "Have it inside. I can smell the bourbon from here and I refuse to wait on your moment." "Last round before the airport, people," Casey called from behind the bar, and then stopped, glass already tilting toward Carol's usual pour, and looked up properly. "Wait. You're not airport people. You're home people." He set the bottle down with something close to ceremony. "You've been gone forever. I marked the calendar just to keep track." "You did not mark it on a calendar," Carol said, finding her chair without needing to look for it, the chair finding her the way it always did. "I marked it in my head, which is a calendar, technically." Casey slid the bourbon in front of her, one ice cube, exactly as promised. "Welcome back." Marcy arrived before they'd even gotten their coats off the backs of the chairs, tray on her hip, and this time she didn't slide into her usual order-taking rhythm at all. She set the tray down flat on the table and put both hands on her hips, and looked at the three of them with an expression that had clearly been building the whole time they were gone. "You," she said, "are going to tell me everything. Right now. I've been checking my phone like a lunatic." "We texted you," Mary said. "You texted me we're fine. Long story. Tell you in person 4 separate times, the whole time you were gone, which is not texting me, Mary. That's torturing me slowly." Marcy pulled the 4th chair round backward and straddled it, the universal signal that she intended to stay a very long while. "Start from the beginning. And somebody order me a drink, because I have a feeling I'm going to need one." "You're working," Casey pointed out. "I'm on break," Marcy said, without looking away from the table. "I am declaring myself on break. Begin." So they told her. All of it, or nearly. The lobster stop with the 3-item menu, the wharf and the old man with the split lobster and the great black dog, the fall in the burying ground among the wild roses and lilacs, the dreams that had started as concussion and ended as something neither Nancy nor any of them had a tidy name for, the buoys counted one by one out on cold gray water, the radio wedged down in the scuppers of a dead man's boat, Detective Cole's flat, unhurried competence, Sheriff Pratt's tired, real smile, Dana Greenleaf twisting her hands together in Cindy's shop before she finally said the thing she'd been afraid to say, Garrett Pelletier's smooth voice in a waiting room, and the coldness of a man calculating exactly how much family was worth to him, and finding the number smaller than anyone watching had expected. Marcy had gone very still part way through, her drink forgotten and sweating a ring onto the table. Her face had gone through several distinct stages over the course of the telling, delight at the lobster shack, open horror at the fall into the cellar hole, something more complicated and unreadable at the mention of the dreams, her eyebrows climbing steadily higher until they seemed to have given up returning to their normal position at all. "You went on vacation," she said finally, "and solved a murder." "We went on vacation," Carol said serenely, "and a murder happened to have opinions about that. That is not the same thing as what actually occurred, and you know it." "It's close enough for a bar," Carol said, and Marcy laughed despite herself, the unwilling laugh of someone who'd been trying very hard to stay appropriately horrified. "And the dog," Marcy said. "Tell me about the dog again. The Newfoundland." "Bowie," Nancy said, and something in her voice, saying the name, was soft in a way none of them commented on. "He's living with Cindy now, the antiques dealer. Turned out she'd always wanted a dog that size and never had the excuse, and Dickie's family up in Portland weren't in a position to take him, so—" She shrugged, but it wasn't a careless shrug. "It worked out. He sends her packages, apparently. Junior does. Lobster, twice a month, no note, no return address needed, just shows up." "That man spent 2 weeks in a cell over buoys he never touched," Mary said quietly. "And the first thing he did once he was out was start sending Lobster to the dog. That's the whole state of Maine in one sentence, if you ask me," Nancy said. Marcy was quiet a moment, turning her glass, and then looked at Nancy with a different kind of attention entirely, the kind reserved for the thing everyone at the table had noticed and nobody had said yet. "And the ranger," Marcy said, "the one who drove you to the airport twice. His name's Owen," Nancy said, and didn't elaborate further and didn't need to because the color that came up in her face said everything the sentence left out. "She has his number written on a folded piece of paper that she checked twice on the flight home," Carol said, "and once more in the airport bathroom, which she thinks none of us noticed." "I noticed," Mary said mildly. "I hate all of you," Nancy said, without any heat in it at all. Marcy finally reached out and stole a fry off Mary's plate, the old habit, exactly as it had been a lifetime ago, and sat back with the satisfaction of a woman whose faith in her own instincts had just been thoroughly rewarded. "I knew something was going to happen the second that sweepstakes email came in," she said. "I said it right here at this table. I said, 'That's not just a vacation.'" "You did not say that," Nancy said. "I thought it very loudly." "That's not the same as saying it." Mary's phone buzzed against the table, and she glanced at it and smiled. The same soft smile she'd been wearing on and off since somewhere over Boston. "Skip," she said to nobody's surprise. "Wants to know if we landed safe and whether I brought him anything more ridiculous than the moose head." "Did you?" Carol asked. "I brought him a jar of fiddlehead pickles he's never going to eat and a postcard of a lighthouse he'll put on his refrigerator and leave there for a decade," Mary said, already typing back. "Some men you buy practical gifts for. Skip isn't one of them." "You're going to marry that man," Marcy said, from halfway to the kitchen, not even bothering to turn around. "I'm going to finish my drink," Mary said, which was not a denial, and everyone at the table heard it exactly that way. "It's close enough for a bar," Marcy said and grinned, and stood to go check on her other tables, tray back up on her hip in one practiced motion, pausing only to add, over her shoulder, in the exact cadence she'd used the night they left, "Your table's been waiting for you. The whole time." "We know," Mary said. "We could feel it, even up there." Outside, the evening had gone properly dark, the Marlin sign steady and bright above the door, headlights sliding by on US 1 and the palms along the highway standing black against the last of the light, and the raw bar kept up its same easy Friday clatter behind them, ice and shucked shells, and somebody laughing at the far end, as if 1,000 miles and one very patient dead man had never happened at all, except that they had, and would go on having happened, folded now into the permanent shape of a story the three of them would tell at this table for years, the way they told all the others. Casey set a fourth glass down at the empty place across from Carol. Small, amber, unbidden. "What's this?" Carol asked, before he'd even said anything. "Nancy mentioned something in a text about an Irish cream ritual," Casey said. "Blessing the trip, or blessing the return or something. I didn't fully follow the logistics, but it seemed like the kind of thing that shouldn't stop just because you're home." Nancy looked at the small glass a long moment, and then picked it up and held it out over the center of the table, thinking of Mary's quiet ritual carried all the way up a foggy Maine coast and back again. The small good habit of blessing an ordinary morning, however it happened to arrive, and finding this once that she wanted to be the one to say the words instead of just watching Mary do it. "To Dickie Herrick," she said, "who got remembered rightly, in the end." "To Dickie Herrick," Mary and Carol echoed, and their glasses met his in the soft, familiar clink that had started more of these than any of them had ever planned for, and would, Mary suspected, watching the light catch in it, go right on starting more. Casey raised an eyebrow from behind the bar, glass still in hand, clearly deciding whether to ask. He decided not to. Some stories he'd learned working this stretch of this coast, a man was better off just pouring for and letting come out whole in their own good time. "Same table next week?" Marcy called, already moving toward the kitchen. "Same table," Mary called back. "Next time we're anywhere at all worth telling you about."